Hi everyone, welcome to week 6. So week 6, our topic is human biological variation. Here's the corresponding chapter. I know the chapters don't line up with the week numbers. What is up with that? Remember there was one week where we were covering parts of 2 chapters. And from here on out, we won't necessarily be following them in order anyway, so don't stress about that. I don't know why I even mentioned it. So, what can evolutionary theory tell us about human variation? That's the title of Chapter 7 in your textbook, which you should be reading because these slides are just a guide to help you identify what's most important in the textbook, but you'll learn much more by reading it. It's like when we have regular classes, we go over the highlights, but we never cover everything. And hey, sometimes we throw in extra tidbits, so it varies. As usual, the quiz is going to be due Thursday at 11:55, just to make things interesting. So last week last couple weeks we've been looking at this hominin tree here, and we've been getting, more and more specific over the past few weeks. And last week, I'm gonna use this fancy schmancy marker here. I love this thing. Makes me feel like I'm in a class, sort of. So we were focusing on Neanderthals and Homo sapiens last week, and looking at how we're the last ones left, and we're kind of looking at that connection there. And one of the things that we said is that, Homo sapiens, as the only hominin left, the ones who spread furthest around the globe, right? We had, before that, Homo erectus that, had spread, in different parts of the African continent, and then here through kind of southern Asia, what is known as southern Asia today, maybe into Europe. Not sure. Neanderthals also in different places, and, some other species that had spread out a little bit. But they all disappeared, and we talked a little bit about that last week as well, as to why and how they might have disappeared. But the fact is, we're the only hominin species left, and we're everywhere now. So, as we said last week, a lot of that was because of our cultural capacities. This doesn't mean that the other hominins didn't have cultural capacities, right? Just like when we say the members of the genus Homo had greater cultural capacities than the Australopiths, it doesn't mean the Australopiths didn't have any. And when we say that hominins as a whole had more than non-human primates, it doesn't mean that non-human primates don't have any culture, right? It's always a question of degree. So out of all of these, Homo sapiens are the ones who were able to adapt to the widest range of places because of our cultural capacities, okay? And it doesn't mean that there was no more biological adaptation. It just means that a lot of the selection pressures, we talk about selection pressures when we say, like, okay, natural selection is putting pressure on certain traits and eliminating some others, say, just through the process of, like, well, if you're not fit to survive in a certain environment, you don't have the traits that help you survive, you're less likely to survive long enough to reproduce, right? So basics of natural selection. And that still acts, but in different ways and in a smaller proportion once you start to have cultural developments. We saw that with fire a couple of weeks ago, with Homo erectus managing to create fire and not wait for it to happen. They were able to start cooking their food, and that led to the decrease in pressure for big jaws and teeth, which we saw in previous hominins, and it allowed the size of our teeth and jaws to get smaller. Okay, so after this week, we're going to be focusing mostly on culture for the rest of the semester. All kinds of different aspects of culture, including our, ideologies and worldviews and language, and things like cultural adaptation, past to present, how people get their food, how people organize themselves, all these different sorts of things. So this week, we're going to take one last week to focus on biological evolution, but how it's impacted variation in our species today. And part of this is cultural too, because everything's biocultural, but we're going to be still focusing a little bit more on biology this week. Okay, so as people spread around the globe, what are some biological adaptations that happened? So here's us, Homo sapiens, right? We're the only hominin left, as we've said a few times, and we've migrated to a whole bunch of different places. And these migrations, on behalf of early Homo sapiens, so we're still talking, a heck of a long time ago, led to biological and cultural adaptations to a variety of environments. People were able to adapt to tropical areas, high altitudes, deserts, colds, you name it. And a lot of them are still present today, and some were, and here this is kind of weird because it says biological and cultural and how some were overridden, so I'll have to fix this before I send it to you. So some biological adaptations were kind of overridden by cultural developments. Again, not overridden is maybe not the best word, but it's just a simple way to put it. Some of the things we were saying before about selection pressure being reduced. Okay, so we're relying even more on cultural adaptations today than those early Homo sapiens. So those early Homo sapiens still had a lot more biological adaptations that happened, and we still do too, but it's just maybe less prevalent in our daily lives, except when we have a pandemic, I guess. So what are we anyway? We're not a race, and so here's a a little present for those of you who like The Good Place and who like Janet and her little saying of not a girl, not a robot, right? So not a race, we're not a race, we're a species, okay? And we've talked about species before, we haven't gone into detail. That's something you'd get into more in a more advanced human evolution course or biology course, but just for our purposes, what we need to understand is that a species is the smallest taxonomical grouping. It's a population that can reproduce itself, and it shares most of it. It shares the most genetic features, right? So when we looked at taxonomy and all these trees, right, with the kingdoms and the classes and the orders and the genera and all that stuff, as you get closer down the tree, from you have a kingdom, you have a lot of living things within a kingdom. Like the animal kingdom has all the animals in it, right? And then when you get to class, you have all the mammals together, and then other classes all together. And then the smaller you get, the more the group has shared characteristics. So the species is kind of, it says the smallest here, but you'll see in the next slide that that's almost kind of a lie, but not completely. Well, you'll understand soon. So what we are not, though, again, is a race. And there are no human races. So we're going to talk about this a bit, and this is important to talk about when we're talking about modern human variation, because there are still some people, including some scientists, who look at diversity, physical diversity or variation among humans, and try to put people into categories based on that variation. And that's been debunked in science. It's been debunked in anthropology and biology, genetic studies, that biologically, scientifically, it doesn't make sense to split people up into races. Now, that doesn't mean these categories don't have an effect on people, because if people believe them to be true, then they act on them, and we'll get to that when we talk about social inequalities. But right now what we're focusing on is, this idea, this biological idea of race, and what is it and how does it not apply to us. So there is no human race. We are a species. And I say this because I always get papers at the end of the semester with these, people will kind of explain why they understand that there are no human races, that you can't split people up into races, but then they'll say this very cliche thing: there is only one race, the human race. And I understand that that sounds like a very beautiful statement, but it's inaccurate. We're not a race either. Okay, we're a species. Call me pedantic, but it's an important distinction. Okay? So, I forgot that my slides did that. It's the little things that make me happy. So we have to start by looking at what a race is anyway. And this is something extra that I'm throwing in. Your textbook kind of touches on this, but they don't use the word subspecies. And this is what race actually means in biology. So biologists, who study other species of animals, for example, sometimes are able to identify races. Race means subspecies, so they can identify subspecies. So that's why in the previous slide, when I said that species was the smallest grouping and that it was almost kind of a lie, that's because in some species, sometimes you have subspecies. And what that is a division in a species that's in the process of speciation. Speciation is an old word for you at this point. We talked about it maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and when we talked about natural selection leading to adaptation over multiple generations, one of the things that we saw was that over time, over many generations, in some situations, if there's a split in the original population and there stops being contact, they can evolve to such a point and that they become so different that they become entirely different species. That's speciation. So when we'd look at these trees and I'd point to the Y part of a branch, and here I'll get the marker out again, but I'd point to that Y and go, oh look, here was a common ancestor. There was a common ancestor here, right? And this was an incidence of speciation, right? And I'd get all excited about it and all that stuff. Now, as that is happening, again, this is not overnight. It's not like you have a common ancestor and the next day, poof, you have 2 different species. This takes many generations, and that can take more or less time depending on the longevity of the species we're talking about, the individuals. Okay, so in that process, you have a species here, let's call it species A, and they're moving right along here, adapting, and then, there's a split that happens in the group, and over time they become separate species here, B and C, okay? So we have that going on, that's speciation. But early on in this process, when they've just split up, maybe some went on the other side of the valley and some struck around, they're still part of the same species here. They're 2 separate groups that are forming, but they're still a part of the same species. So at that point, we have subspecies. Okay? They're still part of the same species, but they're on their way to becoming separate species. Isn't that exciting? Right? So a subspecies is a division in a species that is in the process of speciation. All right? It's when you can divide a species into separate populations, and those populations are eventually, kind of evolving in such different ways that they're becoming separate species. And if they had contact with each other again, they wouldn't be able to reproduce. Are humans in this process? Now, normally in class, I'd leave this open and we'd talk about it for a little while and I'd stare at people. And if I do that now, that'll be weird because you'll just be like, you'll get dead air. So I'll go ahead and answer the question. No, we are not. And we know this. I mean, early humans lived in scattered populations. We saw the map, we saw early Homo sapiens spreading around the globe. These were small populations, and there are some who became very isolated. The human groups who migrated to what is now known as Australia, they were separate from other human populations for a very long time, and other groups like that. And then when people started moving around in times of exploration and encountering each other, they were still able to reproduce. There's still one species. So that's kind of proof right there that humans are not in this process of becoming separate species. People keep mingling, and today more than ever, there's more mixing than there ever was. So it's kind of like not happening. So that's one explanation for why we can say there are no human races, because if race means subspecies, and subspecies means a smaller group in a species that's on its way to becoming a separate species, we know that's not happening. Therefore, there are no subspecies. Therefore, there are no races among humans. Here's another way of looking at it. So, in your textbook, they go into quite some depth on this. What you need to understand, you don't need to know all the genetic stuff for this course. It gets a bit confusing if you're not used to it. But it's important to understand that there are many traits. We're talking about biological traits here, or features, things about our bodies that vary between populations. So when you think about races, right, the typical thing that people look at to differentiate people by race, usually they'll look at things like skin color. That's one biological trait, and it varies among the human species. We have like a whole kind of spectrum of colors, of skin colors. So that's one trait. But it's not the only one. We have so many, and not all of them are visible. Some of them act inside of us, like things like blood types. There are all kinds of biological traits that, vary among the human population. People kind of have stuck on things like skin color because it's very visible. But there are other things. For example, the epicanthic fold that we see in some parts of the world, like the fold in the eye, hair texture. So you'll see some folks in the world with very kind of short, tight, curly hair close to the scalp, and other places where the hair is kind of looser, and straighter. Nose shape and size, you'll see places with wider noses, or length of nose as well. All these things are adaptations to environments. I mean, sometimes people wonder, what about our noses? Well, if you're in a place where the air is very humid, you're going to need a different kind of nose to be able to breathe properly. Hair, so like that tight kind of curly hair can help as well in very hot environments. It can help keep people cool. So these are all adaptations to environmental features, and these are all adaptations that happened a very long time ago. Now the thing is, though, is that if people could be split into races, you would have groups of people with bundles of these traits, and that does not exist. Because the way that these traits vary among humans is not concordant, meaning that, the range of variation for skin color might, vary across groups this way, but then one of the other traits might vary in a different way, so that you'll never have one group of people that shares a whole bunch of traits in common. And we can illustrate with this little graphic here. Usually I do this exercise in class, and we look at this and go, okay, so we have these different shapes. What are some of the variable traits that we can identify, right? Physical things about them that, we see variation. So one thing is shape, right? So we have triangles, we have circles, we have squares. So that's one trait, all right? What else do we have? We have color. So we have blue, red, and green. So that's a second trait that varies. We have the texture of the outside, or I don't know, was texture, let's call it texture, I don't know, right? So some of them have a solid line, some of them have a solid line, and some of them have kind of not quite a dotted line, but it's broken up here like this, right? And some of them, they have different fillings, right? Some here are have a white space. Some of them have these little dotted lines that are vertical. Some have multiple diagonal lines. Some have one diagonal line. And that's our fourth trait. So we have 4 variable traits here. Okay. Now, let's try to put them into categories. Normally I would ask students, okay, how could you group them? All right, well, one way of grouping them might be according to shape. Let's put all the triangles together. Now, other than being triangles, what do they have in common? Not much. 2 of them have a solid line, but their fillings are all different, and their colors are all different. Let's try the circles. Put all the circles together. Well, other than being circles, 2 of them have solid lines, but that's it, right? So you see the pattern here. We could try a different trait to start with. We could start with color. So let's put all the green shapes together. Well, 2 of them have solid lining and 2 of them have the same filling, but that's it. The shapes are different, and there is some variation. So again, we can do this with the red ones, right? Same idea. They're all red. 2 of them have solid linings. 2 of them have a shared pattern inside, but those don't overlap. So that's what we mean when we say variable traits are not concordant, is that there's variation in different physical properties, that humans have, much like these shapes here. Skin color is one of those things, but there are a whole bunch of other things that vary, but they're not all concordant. Okay? So, what does that wind up saying about humans is that when we look at physical diversity today, or these variable traits in our species today, for example, skin tone, hair texture, blood type, nose shape, eye shape, lactose tolerance is another one. That's another biological thing. Just a little parenthesis here. If you've ever been made to feel that you're odd because you're lactose intolerant, actually, lactose tolerance is a recent human thing, because early humans were all lactose intolerant, and humans, I believe, are the only animals to, drink the milk of other animals, but also to drink milk after being weaned, right? So that came about as some people migrated to areas where a way to make a living would be to herd cattle, different kinds of cattle, whether it's reindeer or cows or different things, where they would wind up using the milk to create dairy products, either the milk directly or make cheese or butter or things like that. And so then in those places it became adaptive to be able to digest milk. So you're not odd if you're lactose intolerant, actually. So just I like to reassure people about that, because I know often people are made to feel like, because of the Canadian food guide that up until recently put a heavy emphasis on dairy, that was a capitalist thing, right? Not all humans were all meant to consume dairy. So immunity to certain diseases, right? So if you're in an area where disease is prominent because of certain insects that carry them, for example, it's going to be adaptive to have immunity to that. So these traits are not concordant, so we couldn't create races. Again, if we have all those, there are many other things, many other variable traits among humans, but we can't group any of them together and create one group of people that shares all these traits. All right, so again, as we've mentioned, the typical characteristic that has been used by people who say, yes, races exist, they'll go with skin color, right? And often you have the big three races, black, Asian, and white, and then that leaves a whole bunch of people out, for one thing, right? But then, not all black people share all the other characteristics that we listed. Not all white people do. Not all Asian people do. So these traits are not concordant, so they're not really races in that biological sense. And if you want to know more, you can click on this link in the PowerPoint. It kind of demonstrates it, and there's a little map of the world with, representations of populations, and that you could group them by skin color, but then they don't match on other things like lactose tolerance. If you group them by lactose tolerance, then you see a bunch of different skin colors in that group. So these traits are not concordant. So again, skin color is one of our most visible features, but we could use any other trait to categorize humans if we wanted, and in any case, in any trait that we used as a starting point, we still wouldn't find any of those other traits lining up within that group. Okay, so it's a bit abstract sometimes, so if you do this exercise, if you click here and you'll see it, you have a more visual representation of it. So it's important to consider that. So how human variation winds up working is, when we talk of variation, 90% of genetic variation actually is within these groups that have been labeled as races. Okay, so there's more variation within one so-called race than there is between them. What that means is if you took two random black people from anywhere on the planet, they can be as different from each other as one of those black people would be to a white person. Okay, so it's really important to kind of have this perspective, because then that whole idea that you can kind of create these lines in the sand between groups of people falls apart. Another thing that the textbook points out as well, and that didn't make it into the slides, but it's important, is that when you take, again, skin color, because that's the departure point for so many people who want to split people up by race, You have people, again, these were early adaptations, and you have people in different parts of the world that have very similar skin tones, but those emerged as people evolved to those different environments. So if you go to Australia, look at indigenous people in Australia, they can be very dark as people who has lineages in the equatorial African area, okay? And they're no more closely related to each other than they are to any other peoples, because again, we're all one species. So you can't really create these categories in a way that makes sense biologically. So how do we discuss human physical variation then? Our textbook goes into some explanations on this. It's a bit hard for students sometimes to wrap their brains around this concept here, but the textbook goes into some detail about clines and what are clines. And this is a useful concept to help remember that it's not about groups of people per se. It's more about how these traits that have been used vary. So whether they're visible traits that have been used classically to categorize people into races, or things that are less visible, they vary according to the environment. So sometimes they'll see maps and they show these clines. These are ranges over geographical areas of the distribution of a trait by populations that are along this line. So all these traits here vary along geographical ranges in the world, so clinal variation is the result of adaptations to various environments. And one map you'll see a lot. Oh, by the way, if you want a deeper explanation of how skin color is adaptive, there's a 20-minute video here you can click on, The Biology of Skin Color. It's actually really fascinating. It actually goes beyond what we've often been taught about exposure to the sun, right? It's part of it, but it's not just about, say, skin cancer and vitamin D and all that. It goes beyond that. So have a look if you're interested. So this is a map you'll see often. This one's from the textbook. So when they talk about clinal distribution of skin color, so a cline, like when we talk about, say, a range over a geographical distance, it's kind of like if we were looking in this case, in this direction, if we're looking like north to south, just on the African continent, say, right? You see here, where the equator is, you'll see much darker skin tones, and as you go away from the equator in different directions, you get lighter skin tones. Okay, so this map isn't perfect because what it doesn't explain is like, well, what about here? What about North and South America? Now, again, I have much respect for indigenous explanations of where people come from. The anthropological explanation still holds this kind of idea of people at some point migrating from here in Asia to, over the Bering Strait and into the Americas. So what is said in the textbook is that by the time this migration happened, people had already kind of adapted to these various environments. And so when you go to the very far north here, and like in Siberia, for example, you do have people with darker skin tones. Here on the map it says no data, because I think sometimes they're stuck on this image here and they kind of forget about indigenous people, which is problematic. But you do have darker skinned people who have lived for a very long time in the north. The textbook explains that by saying by the time these migrations happened, we were kind of fully modern humans who relied more on culture. And so people, Inuit people, other northern peoples, for example, could get their vitamin D from their food. So, that would play into it, so the darker skin tones weren't hindering them from getting vitamin D, which is the usual explanation for the emergence of lighter skin in the north, right? Let the vitamin D in, because, they're half the year you're in the dark and all this stuff. But also, people had developed clothing as a way to shelter themselves. So and reduce the skin exposure and things like that. So it's this is a simplified version, but it helps bring across that point that you can't categorize people by race just by looking at skin color, because along this cline here for skin color, you have other variable traits that intersect in different ways. So like we saw with those triangles and squares and all that, it doesn't all line up into these neat groups. So that's how biologists talk about human variation today, instead of grouping people into races. Now, this part here is going to come back when we talk about worldviews, when we talk about language, when we talk about social inequalities and politics. Race still exists, but as a cultural category. So we recognize that biologically the concept of race makes no sense as applied to humans, but at some point in time, so early European scientists in the 18th century kind of, were looking at these human differences, and they categorized things in a certain way, and they put people into these races, and that kind of that was prominent thinking for a long time. So we know now that the concept is not applicable to humans, but the damage has kind of been done. So race among humans, sometimes you'll hear the term cultural construction or social construction. They're very similar concepts. And the textbook talks about this a little bit in their explanation of why we can't be split up into races biologically. They talk about how the idea of race was a cultural imposition on variation. So humans are like that. We have a worldview, we have an idea about how the world works, and we kind of look for data that helps make that true. So that kind of happened. But there's all kind of arguments to be made for the existence of race as a social or cultural construction, something that people made up. And this is, for example, if you've learned anything about Black history in the US, there was a period where even after abolition of slavery, for example, there was still a lot of segregation, and you could have, white skin but be considered black if you had one drop of black blood, for example, and that was enough for people to marginalize you. And not everybody who is considered white today was always considered white. So there are a lot of populations here in Canada today who at some point were not considered white. Eastern Europeans, Italians, Jews. All right, so it's a very blurry concept, and it's a political concept that people can manipulate to maintain power for themselves. So that's something that's going to come back. So I say this, it's important to say this now, because sometimes students, when they hear us say, well, there's no such thing as races, biologically speaking, I've had students who have experienced racial marginalization, racial profiling, who say, are you expecting me to forget who I am? And it's, well, no, not at all. We have to recognize that even if there are no biological racism, there are no biological races, there's still racism, because people still discriminate based on perceived race. So even if race doesn't exist as a biological category, there are still people, and some of them have power over other people, and will, discriminate based on what they think is a division, right? So that's important to acknowledge, and there's more on that here. So something that's going to come back as we talk more and more about culture and worldview is that our cultures and our worldviews lead us to interpret biological variation a certain way. So we could go more, there's a course offered every fall called Race and Racism, and you go more into that history of how, for example, when Europeans started kind of exploring by ship and stuff like that, they'd encounter people who were very drastically different from them. And they hadn't gone over land, so they didn't see those little variations along clines we were just talking about, right? Because if you travel over land, you'll see little differences over time. You travel by ship, you wind up somewhere, and they're very, very different. So their worldview was leading them to interpret this variation in a certain way that would support a difference in power. And that led to the creation of categories of humans, and that led to a creation of a hierarchy. Because if you're just categorizing people, well, okay, but then what inevitably happens is that some people will put those, kind of in a hierarchy with some considered superior over others. There's a really neat video here that kind of talks about racist discrimination and violence at the systemic, institutional, and personal level. I recommend that you watch it. It helps us understand why it's important to understand how race and racism operate in culture and society. And how, the whole thing of like, okay, just because there are no biological races doesn't mean there's no racism. That's developed a little bit more in this video. There's also another example that's often used by bigots, for example, to try to differentiate between racism and races. Keep mixing those terms up. So some people differentiate between races by intelligence, and this is also debunked by science, okay? But not everybody knows that. So a lot of people put a lot of stock in IQ tests, and people like to brag if they have a high IQ. The problem here, and maybe you've already learned it, is that IQ tests are very racist, and they're also classist. So there are a whole bunch of problems with IQ tests, but they're still used as kind of some kind of gold standard of intelligence. So some people have applied this to race and have applied given IQ tests to people from different so-called races to try to prove that some races are more intelligent than others, and that is completely bogus science. The textbook talks about this to some length. I really recommend that you read it. So IQ tests were designed in a certain cultural context, okay? So IQ tests are based in the culture of white middle-class Europeans and North Americans. And these are people who've generally had more access to higher education. So the things that they test for in an IQ test are skills that are mastered by certain populations because it's based in that population. If you were to design an IQ test based in Inuit culture, if you're not Inuit, you wouldn't do very well unless you'd been raised in that same environment by an Inuit family and you learned all the stuff you needed to do. I know I would fail. Okay? So how do you even measure intelligence? That's a very cultural thing. So the argument in the textbook is that what IQ actually measures is cultural knowledge that's based in that cultural context where IQ tests come from. So unfortunately, other forms of intelligent and cultural knowledge are not included in that. So things like survival skills, like, building a fire, butchering an animal so that you can eat and not, die of starvation, that's not on an IQ test. But if everything breaks down and there's an apocalypse, who's going to survive? It's not the people who know how to calculate slopes, do all the formulas and stuff like that. It's people who will know how to get food, right? And cook it. So IQ tests don't account for individual circumstances either, right? So if you're having a bad day and you're taking your IQ test, you're hungry, you're worried about something, it's going to affect your results. Different cultural understandings or linguistic understandings of the world, or how to interpret questions, even, and I didn't put it here and they don't mention it, but even neurodivergence. So I've mentioned before, I'm autistic, and I read a question in any kind of test, and I always, because of how my brain works, not only autistic people are like this, and not all autistic people are like this. I'm just one autistic person, and this is how it manifests in me, is that I overthink everything. Some of you do that too, even if you're not autistic. What do you mean by this question, right? So I would spend hours on this test going, well, do they mean this or do they mean that, right? So these IQ tests don't account for that. They don't account for class differences. So people who do well have usually had access to higher education. And this is something they've tested, where they've given IQ tests only to people within the same social class, but across races. So for example, white people and black people who are from wealthier families and have gone to universities do pretty much the same on these IQ tests. All right? So it's not about race. It's it measures... Intelligence has nothing to do with race. Races don't exist, as we saw, but you can't measure intelligence between different populations using standards that are based in one single cultural context. It makes no sense. It winds up being ethnocentric and racist. So, one last thing to talk about, and this is a bit of a deviation in the sense that we've talked mostly about race to try to debunk that context. It's an important thing. It's really important to understand all of that. But there's something that I thought we'd highlight this week as well to help understand another aspect of adaptation, and that's acclimatization. So far, we've talked about biological adaptation, but the long-term kind, the long-term, evolutionary kind of adaptation through, say, natural selection and speciation, right? There are other kinds of adaptation that you experience in the course of your life. So not all adaptation is multi-generational. Some of it is, okay? So again, what we've talked about mostly is the evolutionary stuff, multi-generational, right? Takes a long time to happen. Changes take place over generations. But there's some adaptation that's shorter term. The textbook talks about this. You'll have acclimatization in bold, and it's kind of interesting because some of it you'll be able to relate to. Some of it is very short term, and they give an example of shivering. Like if you're out, say you're out, it's kind of late summer, and the evenings are starting to get chilly. You forgot a sweater, and then it gets colder. The sun's gone down. You start to shiver a little bit. That's because that's our body's way of preserving heat, because when you shiver, your muscles are producing heat to make sure that your core temperature doesn't drop to a dangerous level. And the shivering stops when you manage to warm up. You go inside, somebody lends you a sweater, whatever. There's also something, if any of you have ever lived in a very high altitude, like very high up in the mountains, if you grew up in that kind of environment, you would, as you grew up, develop greater lung capacity, right? Because there's less oxygen in higher altitudes. So, what happens, people who live and grow up there have a higher, greater lung capacity. But if ever you move there later in your life, when you're 20, 30, 40, whatever, after a while, you will adapt, right? So we talk sometimes about human plasticity, and that's something where within our lifetimes we can adapt to certain circumstances. We have no control over this. It just happens as a shorter term or lifetime adaptation. And there's more on this on these pages here. So I wanted to throw that in there to help you understand as well that adaptation, we tend to talk about it in an evolutionary sense, but it's much broader than that. So that's it for this week. If you have any questions, as usual, don't be shy to let me know. And I hope to see a whole bunch of you at the discussion this week, because some of you haven't gotten started yet, and we're, in week 5. So hope to see you.